Good afternoon, and we're going to reconvene our special council meeting and strat session, and we'll move on to the 2019 development charges, priorities, and rate options. And I believe you're not kicking it off, Mr. Higgy? Oh, okay. Sure. Welcome.
Yes, good afternoon. Pleasure to be with council this afternoon. I'm going to do a relatively brief presentation, if I can get there we go. I'm going to touch a little bit on what development charges are, an overview of the study process, and then we're going to get right into what we'll call preliminary draft calculated rates, recognizing that we're continuing to review some of the projects and allocations with staff. And those of you who've looked ahead at the presentation and the package from staff will know that we've come up with some different rate scenarios, recognizing that there's a fairly significant upward pressure on the calculated rates. And I'll talk a little bit about the process moving forward and then pass it over to staff to go through the second part of the presentation. There we go. So development charges, I've already been before council, but just as a really quick refresher, this is the key fiscal tool made available to Ontario municipalities to fund what we refer to as the initial round of capital cost associated with meeting the increased needs of development. So the idea is that as land is developed, as you build new houses and new non-residential building and people and employees occupy them, they place an increased need for municipal services. And so as you expand the infrastructure, you can recover a share of that infrastructure cost through development charges. These kinds of charges are used by well over 200 municipalities here in Ontario, and basically every growing municipality across Canada utilizes something similar to these kinds of levies to fund that initial round of capital cost. This next slide is just a schematic of the overview of the process that we go through, and it's consistent with the requirements of the Development Charges Act. Basically what it is we look at, we say, how much is the municipality going to grow by over the planning periods? And we're really looking at two planning periods, 10 years for the general services and a longer planning horizon for the engineered services. And then we work with staff to say, well, what are the increased infrastructure needs to meet the needs arising from that development? And we then work through the process of saying, of that capital program, what shares are related to development and what are fundable from development charges. And the Act requires us to make a number of reductions and restrictions in terms of what we're able to fund through development charges. One of the key components for the general services is that we can't establish rates at levels greater than the 10-year historic service level. So we have to, for example, look at library services and say, how have you provided that service on average over the last 10 years? And it's things like how much square feet of library space and how many collection materials have you had for those people? And that creates a limit on what we can fund from development charges moving forward. Once we establish that share of the capital program that's eligible for funding from development charges, we apportion a benefit to residential growth and a benefit to non-residential growth. Then we calculate the residential rates, which are expressed in terms of a charge per type of dwelling unit, single or semi-detached, townhouse or apartment. And then non-residentially is calculated and levied based on a square meter or a square foot of gross floor area for the new buildings. This next slide just provides a summary of the services that are considered under the preliminary calculated rates, which is generally consistent with the current charges. You can see that we have general services and then engineered services. The general services are just like they sound. They're sort of directly related to people. They're things like library, fire protection, indoor recreation, and alike. And then the engineered services are the linear infrastructure of sewer and water, the roads infrastructure, studies, stormwater management, and intensification allowance. As council will be aware, you currently levy two types of charges. One is levied on the suburban area, and it covers off the general services plus most of the engineered services with the exception of the intensification allowance. Within the central neighborhoods, they are subject to the general services, excluding public works, and then the intensification allowance, but not the other engineered services. And so the charge is higher in the suburban area, but lower in the central neighborhoods. As I've already alluded to, there's some significant increased pressure on the rates, and staff have come up with two different scenarios for you to consider in terms of a lower amount of increase. Just as a reference point, we're proposing to keep the engineered service components fixed, not reduce those, and look at the adjustments on the general services, and that'll become more apparent in a moment. Some of you may be wondering, well, why are the development charges increasing in the rate in which they are? And this is something that we're experiencing across many jurisdictions in the province. And I have a slide to illustrate that in a few minutes as well. One of the key things is that construction costs have been rising at a faster rate than the indexing provisions of the bylaw. So even though we index the rates every year for what is notionally considered to be inflation, that index has been running at a much lower rate than actual construction tenders that you've been experiencing, as with most municipalities in Southern Ontario. Another component is the increased land values. Many of these programs require the acquisition of land, and land has been increasing at a much faster rate than core inflation. Another interesting component is the devaluation of the Canadian dollar since the last study was done some 5 years ago. Many of the inputs into the capital program either are acquired in the U.S. or priced in U.S. dollars, and so as the dollar becomes devalued, it puts an upward pressure on those rates. The next one has to deal with the inventorying. As I indicated, the general services are restricted to that 10-year historic service level. And so as we go backwards, we document what the service level was. Your staff has done an excellent job at documenting what the existing infrastructure is in place here in the municipality, much better than what was done previously, and that's largely because of the asset management processes that you've been going through over the last 5 years. And then finally, the comprehensive capital planning. From 5 years ago, you've increased that level of scrutiny in terms of the capital projects, and moving forward, and staff will deal with some of those specifics in a few moments. This next slide is fairly difficult to read given the number of numbers. Hopefully you've got it on a screen in front of you. These are the current rates, and you can see that for in the suburban area for a single or semi-detached unit, the charge is some $11,572. The next column over shows you what the calculated rates are, and you can see that we're calculating a charge of about $22,200, and that's a preliminary calculated charge, but it's an increase, almost a doubling of the charge, an increase of over $10,000 a unit. And you will see that the engineered services, some components are going up and some are going down, but it's not significantly changing, increasing by approximately 20% in an overall sense. But where we are seeing a more significant upward pressure on the charges is within the general services, which are increasing by about $9,300 a unit, or over 150%. Then you will see within the central neighborhoods, the existing charge of $6,000 a unit would go up to over $14,500 a unit, an increase of almost $8,600 a unit. The reason that is proportionally increasing at a level greater than the suburban charge is that the central neighborhood charge is much more dominated by those general services, and because they're increasing proportionally more than the engineered services, the calculated charge is higher in the central neighborhoods. So in recognizing that those are fairly significant increases for Council to give consideration to, staff have proactively looked at the capital projects and identified some that could potentially be removed or decreased in terms of their magnitude of cost to come up with a lower increase. The first scenario that was examined, or what we're referring to as scenario 2 relative to the fully calculated, would result in an increase in 50% of the charge in the suburban area. So going from about $11,500 up to $17,300, and you can see that that's all been accommodated in changes within the general service, and I'll leave it to staff to more specifically address some of those changes. A third scenario would have the overall increase in the suburban area be approximately 25%, or about $2,900 a unit, going from $11,600 up to $14,500. In recognizing that development here in the municipality is not subject just to your charge, but also the regional charge. We wanted to put it in that context as well. The regional charge is more significant than yours, dealing with core infrastructure of sewer and water from the treatment side, and of course the transit infrastructure. Their current charge is about $22,659 per single detached unit. So adding that into your current charge gives a charge of $34,000, which with your increase would be approaching $45,000, or about a 24% increase. However, it's also important to note that the region is also undertaking an update of its study at this time. I believe that their bylaw expires on or about the 1st of August, so that they will need to be releasing their background study at the latest by the end of May. So we would anticipate seeing their new charges sometime in the near future. As I indicated, we've looked at some additional reductions, potential reductions in the charges. One of the things that I like to just highlight is that if you do implement something lower than the fully calculated rates, obviously there's a consequence in terms of the revenues that you will collect and the projects that you will be able to fund. If you remove projects from funding from development charges, but want to continue to construct those projects, that revenue loss from development charges will need to be offset from property taxes. So it's a hard decision from council, and I just want to make you aware of that. This next slide is just to provide a bit of an illustration of other municipalities that have gone through rate increases or changes over the last year or so. And you can get a sense of the order of magnitude, and we've looked at it from lower to higher, and we've identified just the changes at the particular municipality. So, for example, if you're in Markham, you'd have to look at both the Markham change plus the York Region change. And you can see that a number of municipalities have implemented increases or calculated increases of close to doubling of the charge, or about 100% increase. And then there's a core number of municipalities that have seen increases in the order of 50 to 75%. And then some municipalities have had lower increases. But I would note, even within that figure, York Region, which shows as a relatively modest in the context of this, a 20% increase, it had actually done an increase the year previous that was 50% increase. And so, for example, charges in Markham and Vaughan for a single detached home are now in excess of $100,000 a unit. So we have seen a lot of upward pressure on the charges, largely arising to those factors that I indicated to you earlier. One of the issues that we often get asked and get into is, what is the correlation, if any, between the levels of development charges and the pricing of home? It is my opinion as a land economist that there is not a direct relationship. It is the market that sets the price of homes, and that is quite independent of development charges. This has been supported by studies done in places like the City of Toronto, Mississauga, and Vancouver, and other jurisdictions, and also academic literature. And so if one increases development charges, it does not typically have an increase in the price of homes. Counter to that, decreasing development charges, and this has been done in some jurisdictions, has not resulted in a corresponding reduction in the price of new homes being sold. It does, however, I don't want to belittle the point, but it does recognize that development charges can affect the pro forma of some projects, so that if they're marginal projects that otherwise may not move forward or are on the borderline, an increase in development charges can affect the pro forma and whether or not specific borderline projects might proceed under different rates. Not to get into too much technical economics, but over the medium to long term, the analysis indicates that its land values adjust for the increases in development charges and like fees, so that those who want to undertake development will seek and offer lower values for the land to compensate for these higher kinds of input capital costs at the front end of the process. I see people glossing over, so I won't do any more economic speak for now. And just to wrap up with the presentation in terms of where we're going for in the timeline, you will see that we're having this council information session today on the 1st. We need to have the background study completed and out for April 25th in order for it to bring council a bylaw on or about June 24th, recognizing that your current bylaw expires on July 1st, so you want to have a new bylaw in place. And in the middle of there, we'll have a formal public meeting on May the 13th, but we look forward to having dialogue with some of the other key stakeholders as we move through this process. And I would be pleased to pass it on to staff unless there's any questions at this juncture.
I will. I think I should pass it on to you next, and then we'll ask questions in general. Go ahead, Mr. Haggie.
Sure. I just have a few short slides, as you'll see in the slide deck, some highlights from the staff report in addition to what Mr. Binning has already presented. Our time here today, what we're looking for is some input from council about the size of rate increase that you'd like us to move forward with as far as putting out the study and getting public consultation. Those that were on council in a previous term will remember when we were talking about the WIP program, or Water Infrastructure program, we had a similar discussion with council about here are a few different scenarios. There was some discussion about it. There was a consensus built at a session like this, and that's exactly what we're looking for today, is if we can get some idea of what kind of rate increase you'd be looking at, and if it's not the maximum rate, are there any projects that are non-starters as far as things that should be in or things that should not be in. You are not making a decision on what the rate increase will be today. That is not a final decision that happens today by any means. This is just what should go out to the public for discussion, consultation. There will be another opportunity for public input in May, and then the final decision on rates will not happen until the end of June, as was shown in the previous slide as far as the timeline goes. So just to make sure that everybody's aware that this is not a final decision by any means. In addition to the comparison that Mr. Binning had in his presentation about rate increases as far as DC rates go, in the staff report we've included this graph that shows a DC rate comparison for large municipalities in Ontario. Kitchener shows up 4 times on this slide. We're all the green bars. Our current rate is the leftmost green bar. If we had a 25% rate increase, is the next green bar that comes over. 50% is the third, and then if we went with a max rate increase, our rate increase is the fourth or the rightmost green bar on the graph. In any of those scenarios, you can see that we are under the average for large municipalities in Ontario. That's kind of the orangey bar that's, I would say, about 2/3 of the way over on the graph. And so regardless of what decision is made or direction we get as far as development charge increases go through this study, we expect that we would be below average for large municipalities in Ontario. It's not plotted here, but Cambridge just put out their study. Their rate increase is slightly more than what the Kitchener max scenario is. So if Cambridge's increase were approved as presented or as it's on the street, they would be just to the right of the Kitchener max bar here and just under the average. As far as the scenario goes, various scenarios go, Mr. Binning alluded to the rate increases in the different types. So we've got the max increase scenario, a 50% rate scenario, and a 25% scenario. And in the staff report, we've tried to provide some information about the types of projects that would be in or would not be in under those various scenarios. This is just the legend that explains that. The following slide is a repeat of the appendix to the report. And so if you see a green check mark, it means in that scenario, that project is in and fully funded. If there's a down arrow, it means that there's been reduced funding for that project in that scenario. 2 arrows down means that a reduced figure has been further reduced, and X means that that project is no longer in. And so the final 2 slides of the presentation simply show the same information that's in the appendix to the staff report. You'll see that in the max rate scenario, if you go down that, every single project that is on the general services side is included in that scenario. It could be fully funded, everything could be in. As we move to the 50% scenario, you'll see some reductions, down arrows, you'll also see X's. And so in those situations, to move from the max rate scenario to the 50% scenario, we've reduced all of the recoveries, there's 4 of them, from previously built capital projects that were able to recover those funds. And so we've reduced the amount that we're going to recover from the total that we could recover, and we've reduced it by 50% in order to fit it into that scenario. You'll see X's on all of the things that are listed as provisions. And the provisions are capital projects that could be funded but haven't specifically been identified. There's been no work that's been completed on them, so they've been completely removed in the 50% rate scenario. As you move to the 25% rate scenario, you'll see some double arrows down, you'll see single arrows down, and you'll see a lot more X's because we can't fund as many capital projects if we're not bringing in that much revenue. You'll see that on this slide, indoor recreation, we are losing some of the community centers in the 25% rate scenario. Some of them could not be funded in that scenario, or the Mill Courtland Community Center would have some funding available to it, but not full funding for it in order to fit those in. And those projects were chosen based on the priorities that Council set through the Leisure Facilities Master Plan discussion. So we started at the lowest priorities and started working our way back up. You'll see again on the second slide here for outdoor recreation, again, as we move from the max rate scenario to a 50% or a 25% rate scenario, we cannot fully fund all of the outdoor recreation priorities. And again, we started at the lowest priorities and started working our way back up that list. So that ends my presentation. I'm sure there will be some questions, but again, we're looking for some discussion amongst council and direction about a preferred scenario as a starting point for discussion to go out to the community.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Haggie. So we do have some questions. I don't know if they're in particular to you or to the consultant, so we'll go with Councillor Singh.
Yes, thank you, Acting Mayor Ioannidis. Quick question. So on the charts, as described for suburban area, are we really referring to greenfield development?
Yes. So the central neighborhood is inside, starting in the downtown. As you go out, it stops at the Expressway, Westmount, and the City of Waterloo. So anything outside of that is considered suburban.
Okay, but outside of that, if it's still in a built-up area and it could be some intensification there, that's still considered suburban, or is that still considered as a central at that point?
It's suburban as far as the DC study goes.
I see, okay. So the other question I had was, in comparison to the development that happens into our central neighborhoods, compared to the suburban, what's that ratio?
The percentage?
The reason why, as you look for that data, I'll ask further to that question, is the DC review also a way for a municipality to, I wouldn't say social engineer, but still put certain, priorities of where we want to see our development happening? Do we want to see our city going outward and, or suburban sprawl, or do we want to see it develop in a more sustainable way? And could the DC charges help with that strategy? Do we imply that effort as part of the DC review, or we don't consider that?
So it can be used to incent that. I would say if we want to incent that, aside from a way that the rates are calculated, then taxes end up paying for it. So I would suggest we have had that. We had a downtown core. It was exempt. They did not pay DCs, but it was at the expense of taxpayers.
No, so I'm going in a different line here. I'm seeing, the increases that are outlined here. On the suburban, it's still relatively less compared to what's being suggested in all the scenarios and for central core. And depending on if you have this information, if more development is happening still in the suburban outlining areas, and we had a greater increase there, and as not much, or a reversal. For example, this may put it into context. In scenario, say let's go with scenario 2, it's being suggested 50% for suburban, whereas it's being suggested as 71% for central neighborhoods. But if you did the reversal, 71 instead for suburban and 50% for central neighborhoods, could we not, depending on the information, could we not see greater revenue coming in? If my assumption is correct that more development happens on the outlining areas, while at the same time encouraging, intensification and more sustainable development in our inner built areas as opposed to urban sprawl.
Right. I'll let Mr. Binning respond.
So one of the things that I quite like about the Kitchener approach is it's a calculated differential charge between the central neighborhoods and the suburban areas. So there isn't an inbred revenue loss associated with that. So it's calculated and it's based on those general services. The general mix of forecasted development between the suburban and the central neighborhoods is about 65% in the suburban area and 35% in the central neighborhoods. So that if we accentuate the difference and try to do the 50% based on the central neighborhoods, obviously there will be a proportionally greater increase or decrease in the suburban areas, which will have a very significant revenue impact on the city, and the staff charts showing the projects that get removed or reduced would have to be more of them.
So let me just get that clarification on that. If I heard correctly, 65% is happening in
The suburban area,
and 35% is happening in the
central neighborhoods.
So if you were to consider the approach of having a greater increase in the suburban side and not so much on the central, we would be seeing a greater increase in revenue into our DC.
Yes, just through the chair. The difficulty is that it has to be a calculated difference. It has to be based on the charges that are being levied in there. If we were to want to just arbitrarily change that relationship, it would have to be a function of the capital programs, and so it would result in the need to make further adjustments to the program, because the relationship and the way it is, we can't skew it further than the way it is.
Just have a few more seconds left, so not to push this further, but much of the programs that are being suggested are in the suburban areas anyways. So how would that really affect that rationale then?
The way in which the charges are calculated are reflective of the benefit of the works. For example, the fire services was previously just done on the suburban area, but there is an identified need for additional fire station and response needs in the central neighborhoods, and so we've had to reflect that of benefit, and in our opinion, working with staff, that there are benefits. And for example, parks in the central neighborhoods tend to be more expensive than those in the suburban areas, and so there's an equitability in spreading them across the municipality.
Key back in, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Johnson.
Yes, thank you, through the mayor. My question actually is for you, so I'm glad that you're still up there. I was wondering if you could actually comment on the economics piece. You did have a slide around that, that regardless of whether or not the charges go up to the max, it really does not affect house prices either way. If you could just expand on that, would be helpful.
Yes, so I'm basing that on experience of studies that have been done in other jurisdictions, both here in Ontario and across the country, and also through the U.S. Then, with respect to residential development charges, capital cost recovery charges, that really it is the market that establishes the price of a home. That it is individual, or it's not impacted directly by the input prices. It's a very different kind of commodity than what one might produce when producing a widget, to use an economic term. And so what happens is that land economics is quite a complex environment in which there's multiple players, everyone from the owner of the land, the purchaser of the land, the developer of the land, the construction trades that do it, and then the end purchaser, and parties in between there. And so establishing those relationships between the different parties as they exchange monies, have profit expectations, it establishes in the end what the market's willing to bear. So if someone's going to pay $500,000 for a single detached home, that's what they're going to pay. In order for the development industry to proceed with that, they are going to look for a return of about 20% at a minimum on their product. If they can do it within that pro forma, it works. If it doesn't, then either the land prices have to come down, or the price or the project doesn't move forward. That's the problem.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to go with staff first. Okay. I just want to try to refresh my memory as to how this works. Okay. In order to come up with all of these figures, you've actually had to lay out all the projects that we have in our capital forecast for the next 10 years, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so you've got that work all done, and wherever it turns out, whether it's a suburban project or a central project, that's already in what's based on the capital forecast.
Correct.
Right? And that's why you say it's a calculated figure, right? Yeah, okay. Just going to one of the schedules there that says that the inflation rate has an impact. In your projections here, what inflation rate have you used?
So all the costs that you'll see in the appendix are in today's dollars. And then as we slot them into the capital forecast, we inflate them and we use 2% per year to slot them in.
Okay, so the ones that are down the road, you've used the 2% figure. Can you use a higher figure? Are you limited to using that 2%? If you're saying that in actual fact, inflation is turning out to be higher than what we expected, so why can't we use a higher figure in our plans?
We could. What we have used in our capital forecast for all capital projects is 2%. So we're just being consistent across the
and
whole
I appreciate
forecast.
but I'm just saying if, you go with higher figures, that gives us more money, right?
It would increase the, well, I guess for this purpose, it would not increase the rates because we're calculating the rates based on 2019 dollars anyway.
Okay. I don't quite understand how the evaluation of the Canadian dollars, you say that things are either acquired from the States or priced in U.S. dollars. Do we actually acquire that much stuff in Canada and around here?
So we don't acquire directly a whole lot of things specifically in American dollars, but vehicles is one area where the American dollar is a big player in that. I think our engineering folks have said over time sometimes some of the piping that they're using, also the American dollar comes into play.
The other thing I'm concerned about, should we not have some information about what the region is doing? Do you have any ideas?
I'm part of a working group for the region with all municipalities. I asked them last Friday what they had as far as a rate increase, and what are you talking an inflationary increase or something more substantial? And they said preliminary, they don't have rates that they can make public. They believe it's probably more than inflation, but that's as good of information as
Like
I
that bar chart that you show would change substantially if you have what the region is going to do, would it not?
It could. They're a larger part, just like with property taxes, they're a much larger part of development charges than we are.
So that could go all over the place, really, if they come out with a substantial increase.
A substantial increase, yes.
Do we have any idea on what percentage DC charges would be of a selling price of a unit of a property?
I don't I don't know.
Yeah,
We haven't looked at it specific here for Kitchener, at least not recently. The provincial average, and based on a broad range of jurisdictions, is between 6 and 9%. And the last data that I saw that included Waterloo municipalities, regional Waterloo municipalities, you were in the lower end of that 6 to 9% range.
Okay, at any rate, you're totally convinced, you're the professionals, that this really has no impact on selling prices.
Well,
Yes, that's my opinion. I think you may hear a different opinion from members of the stakeholder, the developer group.
Yeah.
It can affect the pro formas on particular projects.
I appreciate that. I understand. So basically here, we really are free to do whatever we would like. We're not really hurting anybody because this really has no impact on it. Okay, I have one more quick question of staff, okay? What would staff give us recommendations on everything? What is your recommendation here?
So I would suggest, my personal opinion is the 50% rate increase achieves a lot of the things that council has already endorsed as far as priorities, and that is a rate less than the maximum rates.
Well, why wouldn't you recommend 100%? The max?
I'm thinking about what I am likely to hear through the stakeholders group, and trying to be mindful of the price increase, what we've heard here in council chambers. Pardon? I'm
hearing that has no impact. Okay, no, okay, I thought you might go for the max, so I always like to go for the max. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Chapman.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. When you talk about reaching out to the public, who is the public in this case?
So there is a public input session that anybody's free to attend, just like a budget meeting. We intend to have more specialized discussions with the development industry, so the Waterloo Region Home Builders Association, Grand Valley Construction Association, some of the builders in the downtown. We have a list of people from previous studies that we've at least offered to engage with. So we have engagement specifically with them, as well as making it known to the broader public that they can come and talk about whatever they would like.
So they'd be separate consultation processes?
So we have something specific, yes, for the development industry, and then just make it more widely known to the broader public.
Okay. My other question has to do with the current development fees. What's the relationship between the fees that are current? I know the downtown core is an exception, but around the rest of the city, what's the relationship between what the development fees are in relation to the maximum amount in 2014? Like what happened in 2014? Was it maxed out or?
So in 2014, yes, the maximum rate was applied. The increase was in the range, it was less than 15%.
Okay.
So it was a much smaller increase. We didn't have as good of inventory information that we do now. We didn't have the land price escalation that we are seeing today.
So in 2014, it was maxed out, and the recommendation or what came out of that revision was just an increase of 15%?
Yes.
Which put it in at what rate in relationship to what could have been the maxing out? Like, was there an increase in that max level at that point, greater than the 15%, or was it about in keeping with that?
No, the maximum calculated rate, it was something just less than, I want to say 12 or 13% on the single detached unit.
So basically you maxed out again with a very minor variation, is that correct?
Sorry, are you saying from the study before, in 2009?
Yeah. Well, I'm saying 14, because isn't it every 5 years?
Every 5 years, yeah, so we maxed out in 2014, but that increase was only 15%. And so if we were to do the same today, we would be looking at a 92% rate increase.
Okay, so the difference, that huge difference, is because the development fee allowance has gone up that much? So it wouldn't be unique to Kitchener necessarily. It's that those provincial guidelines have increased by that much?
No, there's no, I would say it's not because of legislative changes. We have much better information now than we did then. So in the general services, so for instance, indoor recreation, outdoor recreation, you have to do a look back at what you've had for over the last 10 years, and the information we had in 2014 was not nearly as good as we have now. And so we were capped out at something like $20 million that we could recover over 10 years. We've done that calculation now, and it's closer to, say, $40 million, because we have much better data.
So we're basically doing catch-up.
Yes.
Is that what you could say?
Yeah, so I would. If we had the same data set today that we had back then, the maximum rate increase would have been much higher than 15%.
Okay. My last question was, if we look at the chart, the DC rate comparison chart, The other cities that we're comparing with, have they all, no, the graph actually, I was thinking of, well, it's just easier to get a visual.
Sorry.
That one. There. When we look at the other cities on this chart, could some of them still potentially increase their rates this year, or have they already increased?
Some of them are up. So, for instance, Cambridge is on the list. This is information from the BMA study from 2018. So it was from a fixed point in time. But yes, there could be increases. Every year this will get updated based on what rates are in effect. So I don't know who's in process exactly right now.
Because that information might be useful.
Mr. Binning is saying many of them are in process right now.
In process. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Urbanovic. And I want to touch upon what Councillor Chapman was mentioning, because to me, I would like to know where Waterloo stands, where Guelph stands, and where London stands, because to me, those are our competitors. And when it comes to development. So I think that's pertinent information. I'm glad that Cambridge was there, but where do those three municipalities stand?
So Waterloo has just started their process. They will not be done before council needs to make a decision. I'm not sure about Guelph or London.
And I'm going from memory on Guelph. It's not one of our clients, but the residential rate increases, I believe, are in the order of 15 to 20%, depending upon the unit. And then London is just in the process of releasing its study, and there's some upward pressure on those rates as well. I'm just not sure of the magnitude. And the Guelph non-residential charges are increasing at a higher level than the non-residential.
Okay, so in other words, they're already, if we look at Guelph in particular, they're already lower than us. So they would be, and if we even went the 50% route, they'd even be still further lower than us. Because you're saying they're going 0.25% higher.
Yes, we can double check that in advance of the public meeting for sure.
Okay. My other question is, I don't know if this is with you, Mr. Benning. How does our downtown development charges, how will this reflect if we go along with implementing them?
So is the question if we charge them or if
yes, if we charge them.
They are included in
They are included?
Yes.
In here as if we're charging them?
Yes, the exemption is gone as of March 1st, and so they're included.
Okay, and yeah, I don't have any other further questions. Thank you.
Councillor Davey, you haven't spoken yet, so you're next.
Thank you. A few questions. One of my concerns is housing affordability. So do we have the ability to levy DCs based on a percentage of the value or sale value of the home versus just whether it's a built structure or not?
I believe the answer is no. It's a legislated calculation that you have to go through. You can just say 5% of the value of the home.
So it has to be a flat fee regardless of the type of structure being built, essentially, or the affordability of it.
Yeah. Oh, you can subdivide it a whole bunch of ways. So we could have area ratings for multiple parts of the city. It just becomes impractical at some point to do that.
Okay. What's our ability to phase it in? Like, for example, if let's say we want to get to over 5 years, we want to get to we want to increase it by 75%. So we decide the best way is to raise that by like 15% a year. Can we do that?
Yes, the charge could be phased in. It would result in reduced revenues, which would have an impact on the capital program you could fund. But yes, the increase could be phased.
Okay. One of my other concerns is that, I believe to a degree that it doesn't affect the final cost. I think that only works to a point. I think if you raise the rate significantly enough, I think it obviously would get added to a cost. But my concern is one of the affordability issues is supply and demand. And we keep talking about pro forma, but essentially what we're talking about is if we raise rates to too significant a degree, some developments will not go ahead. So how do I see that reflected in the fees that we recover? Presumably if we raise rates 300%, nothing would get built in Kitchener, and we would get 0 DCs. So why isn't there a metric in here saying at some point we're going to see development fees go down because we're not building as much?
So I would say we're not at that point yet. I don't know what the sensitivity on break even or what have you is. If look at the chart that is in Mr. Binning's presentation, you can see the quantum of the development charges for Kitchener are lower than some of a number of other large municipalities in Ontario. Likewise, in the graph here, we're below average at current point. But yes, once we get to a certain point, unless the housing prices continue to rise, then it will become a point where we wouldn't be able to, or developers would not be able to make their money back and develop.
Okay. Yeah, so that's part of the part that concerns me, competing with Waterloo, and there's that wild, I'm glad Councillor Gazzola touched upon it, there's the wild card of what the region does. But I guess my concern is how do I get that, how do we see that information? Because presumably there's some point where if we raise rates to a certain degree, we will see less development and less revenue. So is there any information or data out there that details that?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know if the development community would have that or be willing to share it. I think they're the ones that would have the information about how tight they are on any of their margins. Regardless if it's development charges, housing materials, labor, there's a whole bunch of inputs into a home price.
Okay, because presumably this matters a lot, because historically in Waterloo, when they had their DC exemption expire, we had a whole bunch of building permits come in we saw in Waterloo, and we're seeing that now in Kitchener as our DC exemptions expiring. I presume that we're going to see a slowdown in the downtown once those fees expire. So I think I would like to see some of that information, and I'm really uncomfortable making this decision based on what the Region of Waterloo does as well. Yes, so would you, in terms of direction today, if we were to do something, a sort of a stepping process, is that something that, is that direction that you would want to receive today as you go to the public? In terms of an annual increase to get to a point we want to be at?
So if there's interest in phasing in, we'd like to hear about that today so we can consider that and make that known to the public for comment and interest. Because on the one side, it would benefit the one group that would come in. So people that are building new homes would be for that, but it would come at the expense of some projects. So there may be people on the other side that are looking for a community center or a park or a trail to be built, and that couldn't happen because the funds don't come in.
Okay. And just at the time, just one last question, Mr. Mayor. In terms of when the DCs are payable, I think I heard in the presentation that they have to be paid up front before the development occurs. Is that correct?
They're normally paid at the time of building permit. At
the time of building permits. Do we have the ability, just because the pro forma is something that concerns me, do we have the ability as a municipality to make the payment receivable at the point of sale versus the point of before anything's built?
I believe we're allowed to do that. It's just that in discussions I've had with Mr. Sealing, when we kind of lose a great deal of control or power in actually getting that money when we don't make it payable at a building permit stage, because he can't hold back occupancy based on DCs not being paid.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Galloway-Sealock.
Yes, so Councillor Chapman already hit one of my questions, but I wanted to take it just a little bit further with regards to the rates that we've used in the past. We've decided, or you've mentioned that in 2014 we were at the max rate that we could with the information that we had in front of us.
Correct.
Do you know what that is for the 2009 and the 2004? Were we maxed out there as well?
I don't know. I don't know if... Pardon? That we were? So people that were here are suggesting, yes, we were at our max rates then.
Okay, thank you. And so if we don't max out, can we recover it at a later date from the DC, from a different DC study?
Yes, it may require a catch-up and increase in rates at that point in time.
Right, so basically, because we didn't have the information that we have now the last time, as it's been said, we're doing the catch-up this time around in order to get us where we should actually be.
Correct.
Okay. That's all my questions. I have comments at the appropriate time.
Okay. Councillor Michaud, I don't believe you've spoken yet. Oh, go ahead. Oh, you turned off. Hold on. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just have a question. I've read this, and I'm new to this DC rates. There's nowhere mention of infrastructure projects in here. I know infrastructure is part of a whole development process, but do the DC rates, does this money go into the infrastructure as well?
It absolutely does. It just is not the focus of this report, because if we were to go with, we're just assuming that all of those projects need to be in, because we need those in order to develop communities. So we need a water main, we need a road, we need a sewer in order to have that development. So we haven't provided all of the information for the whole capital program, just the general side that could be reduced if we went with something less than the maximum rates.
So do we get that information later, or that just doesn't show up?
Yes, it does. You will get it later. It shows up. We have the DC studies about that thick, and all of that detail is included in there.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Singh, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I want to come back to really the whole aspect analysis of do DCs really affect the housing price and aspect of affordability. And I know it's already been asked numerous times, but I think one thing that really resonated in my part was that there's no question that it can affect certain pro forma of some projects. And that's a struggle for me because, again, that speaks to inventory. So if some projects are off the line, or they shift elsewhere, potentially that would reduce the inventory overall in the marketplace here in the Kitchener or Waterloo region per se. That would have an effect on the housing price, ultimately, would it not? It's a triple effect, right? It's, any stone thrown in the pond is going to have some ripples no matter what.
Right. So I don't want to be interpreted to suggest that this is not a component of the price of constructing homes, because it most definitely is. It's about whether it affects the price. But with respect to the pro formas, the analysis that's been done in different jurisdictions, but it identifies something like purpose-built rental. If it's to be affordable purpose-built rental, those pro formas are exceptionally tight for a variety of reasons. And so there are communities that have programs in place to address that. There's things like deferral agreements. Just to clarify a point made earlier, the default collection point is issuance of the building permit. If you want to do something later than that, it has to be done on an agreement-by-agreement basis. And so there are jurisdictions that for purpose-built rental, when it's going to be affordable or attainable, they can defer those payments off under an agreement. I also want to stress that the way that this charge has been structured here with the central neighborhoods, which is at 2/3 of the price of the suburban one, and that many of the projects that might be sensitive on a pro forma basis are going to be located within those neighborhoods. The more dense intensification, trying to attract something at an attainable level, maybe not what we call affordable under the provincial definitions. And so you've already structured a charge that reinforces your planning objectives of trying to attract and encourage development within your central neighborhoods.
But they're increasing at a greater percentage, though. Those charges are increasing at a greater percentage, though.
But they are still at 2/3 of the price in the suburban neighborhoods.
But no, that's fine, and I think, again, it's really feeling like an argument, but the price has already been filtered into the market. If any increase to that will have some effect. Yes, it's already been structured lower long time ago, so this is not a new thing that we're doing, correct? There was a differential already to begin with, even in the last DC review. So this is not a new thing. That's already been structured into the market as it is. So any increase is a new increase.
And the investment in the transit infrastructure here in Kitchener and Waterloo has had a direct impact on land values in those areas and makes those projects much more reachable and realistic and pushes up the price of those units along those transit corridors.
Okay, I appreciate that. Any way we go at it, there will be some impact to this. So speaking of that, at the same time, any change that we do will ultimately affect, the proposed improvements to community improvements that we have outlined through our projects. And so we have to be sensitive to that as well, and I appreciate that. So I'm trying to get to kind of similar to Councillor Davies' suggestion, how do we try to get both? How do we improve the pro forma and try to make sure that there's no deferral projects or projects going elsewhere, while at the same time having the level of increase that accommodates to the improvements that we want in the community at the same time. So he had asked about two potential ideas. One is a phased-in approach. How long would it take for us to really realize what the impact would be or cost that would affect any proposed projects?
Do you mean how fast can we model it?
That's correct, yeah.
I don't know.
The reason why I ask that question is it's difficult for this committee to make, or council to make a suggestion not realizing what that effect's going to be, right? Or do we have an opportunity we can give that suggestion to staff and that's a suggestion taken to the public and then ultimately we'll see all options at that point?
So we would like to have direction from council today as to the amount of increase, and if we want to suggest that there could be a phase-in, and we could talk about what that could look like, and what capital projects would not be able to be funded if something like that were to be done.
So that would be just one extra information available to the public to give feedback on.
Yeah.
But ultimately, in the end, council will decide which option scenario, A, B, C, or the phased-in approach. Because we're not deciding today the rates anyways.
Correct, but we don't want to take 75 options out to the public. We want to take one. We have to publish one study, not multiples.
Right.
So
just have one brief question, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it shouldn't take too long to answer. The other question that Councillor Davey asked was a deferral, right? Pay the DC at a later point. I understand you want to have the control. Do we have the option of structuring that the DC could be paid upon occupancy permit? So not when the building permit is applied for, but when the occupancy permit. So we still have control as to making sure that we get the DCs.
So, as Mr. Binning said, we could do that, but it would have to be on an agreement-by-agreement basis, not just the standard. Council has passed a policy like that for affordable housing units. So we already have that for that sector. Is something during the last term of council that was decided.
But that doesn't cost us anything less just because we get it a few months afterwards.
There'll be a nominal decrease in investment income, but yes, there's not a large cost to that.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gazzola?
If we go phasing in, there's a cost to that, right? And the cost is we've got to pull out projects, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
it means we get less revenue because
you've got to pull out projects, yeah.
Right, instead of paying 50%.
This is a calculated thing. What we've got in the calculation is based on our capital forecast, and you've just gone and buzzed out all the figures and come up with these answers. If we want to start giving deals like that or phasing in, the only way is to reduce projects. The only other way to give breaks is by giving exemptions, and that costs the taxpayer money.
Correct.
Okay. I was going to ask this. First question, can you just explain a little bit the 2/3 between the suburban and the central? Just give me an example of how that works.
So we've done a detailed population growth model for over the planning period, and it's that's just how the math worked out. It's not like we say it's 2/3, 1/3. It's what kind of growth do we believe we're going to have? Where is that growth? What type of unit? How many people are in that unit? And that's the way the math.
But if you've got a project in the central area that costs $1 million, that goes in your calculation at $1 million, right?
For the revenue it generate?
Yeah.
We don't look at specific sites that would be developed. It is what's the trend as far as the growth that we're seeing in, single detached houses, in apartments, that sort of stuff. We've used the regional model that they have, and our planning staff have made some adjustments based on their knowledge.
I'm still not clear on the 2/3, but that I'll take it out.
Sure.
Okay. I was going to ask you this question. Did we max in 2014? And to me, I'm going to give the answer. As long as I can remember, around this horseshoe, we've taken everything we could get so that whatever we get there, we don't hit our current taxpayers. And that's why whenever we often had people throwing in, well, can you do this out of development charges? And you would often say, no, you can't do that. Can you do this? We've always taken every project that we can get and put it in. So we've always maxed.
Sure. I would suggest in some previous studies, we haven't had the space that we have within our caps. So I would say suggested different this time versus some previous times is we have all the identified capital projects and we have some space for other things that we haven't identified specifically yet.
Yeah, you have better information.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Councillors Marsh, Schneider, Chapman, are these still questions? Okay, Councillor Marsh.
Thank you. So I'm just looking at the rate scenarios for 50% or 25%, and even though there are not as many X's as you might expect, I mean, we are seeing a loss of $23 million worth of indoor rec and $10 million of outdoor rec. I just wonder if staff could clarify on what would we be deferring to tax, a different source of revenue or not building if we weren't to go to the max?
So those provisions are for nothing that's specifically identified. So it's not like we're losing something. We could collect that money for an indoor recreation facility that was not one of the top 5 priorities in the leisure facilities master plan, and potentially do that. But that's what that provision account could fund, but it's not as if there's something specific that was endorsed by council as part of the leisure facilities master plan. That would not be done within the 10-year time frame.
Right. So there are lots of projects that the community wants or needs, but didn't make it to that top 5 list, right? So,
yes.
So, okay. All right. Thank you.
Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor Brbanovic. I think part of the conflict here is we have 3 municipalities that are all very close to each other, and I think there's a concern that if ours are higher than our neighbors, we may lose out on some developments. Is there any evidence of this? Are there other municipalities that are close that may have seen this effect, or is it if there's a great space to develop in whatever municipality, someone's going to develop it anyway?
So my experience in looking at different jurisdictions in which there's, like in York Region, if you've got close municipalities that might be deemed to be competing with each other, they all have fairly high development charge rates. Those with the highest, Markham and Vaughan, tend to continue to attract the highest amounts of growth. If you look in Simcoe County, the city of Barrie and Innisfil and have the highest rates of anyone in the county, and they continue to attract the highest amounts of development. When you go into jurisdictions and municipalities decide that they're going to reduce their development charges or even eliminate them, that has not resulted in them attracting a greater share of regional growth, small R regional growth. So that's why I'm saying I haven't seen the correlation based on my experience and the evidence.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, maybe this was kind of answered just now, but my question was, with rates having been maxed out since 2004, and maybe this is a staff question, did the city experience a slowdown in development projects because of having those maxed out rates?
Through the chair, not that I'm aware of, but again, I don't think those maxed out rates are in the same ballpark of what we're talking about here.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Gazzola, your comments, right? Okay, so I have a few questions, and I apologize if you touched on this while I stepped out. But the City of Waterloo, I see it on the bar chart, but are they going through a development charge review as well, and what's happening there?
So they've just started. They are using Hempson, so
okay.
They're not going to be anywhere near knowing what their rate increase is by the time council needs to make their decision.
But in all likelihood, we'll probably have one. Do we have a sense, or? And if you can't say, you can't say. I appreciate that.
Yes, sorry, it's very early in the process. We're just doing inventory meetings this week, and so it won't be until early next year that we have even preliminary rates to share. But I mean, the Cambridge experience shows that there's an upward pressure on rates here in the region due to all of the factors that I listed before.
And I guess there's the added difficulty in Waterloo that, quite frankly, they have very little greenfield development left, space for greenfield development. So any of their stuff will tend to probably be along the Ion corridor and so on, and be up instead of out, correct?
Right. And sometimes accommodating intensification of built-up areas can be more extensive infrastructure-wise. And so until we see the engineering plans and the costs and the urban park side of things, we won't have a clear sense as to what the...
Right, okay. In looking at the report that we have in front of us, have we looked at, I mean, we're assuming that it's status quo, I presume, from the province in terms of their whole development charge review, and we're assuming that there won't be any changes, and if there are, we'll deal with that when it happens?
Correct. We have not tried to guess what might come out of that.
Okay. And can you, obviously, if it happens before we decide or make our decision, that will simply allow us to slow down our decision, revisit some things if we need to, and go from there. But if it happens afterwards, would that then require us to reopen the bylaw, or what would happen then?
I would look to Mr. Binning. I know he's much more informed on this than I.
Based on previous experience, and when there's been legislative changes, the legislation itself will deal with transitional rules. When the Act was overhauled in a major way in '97, they put a moratorium on the bylaws for 2 years, and you had to come into conformity with the new rules within a 2-year time frame. I'm sort of hoping that we're not to that degree of magnitude, but whatever the rules are, we'll adjust with those as we come forward and as we know about them. The modeling is nimble enough that if we're made aware of them before the bylaw patches, we can make those adjustments fairly quickly.
Okay. Next question is, I don't know if it's Mr. Hagee or actually maybe more Mr. May question, but a lot of this that we're talking about actually has to do with recreational infrastructure. And so whatever decision we make will impact presumably the leisure facilities master plan. I mean, this, from that perspective, does staff have a view on this?
So through you, Mr. Chair, sorry. Notwithstanding Mr. Hagee's response to a question, the corporate leadership team has not taken a position on what is recommended here today. It's a strategic session, and so we don't generally make recommendations at strategic sessions. What I can tell you is, as Councillor Gazzola has noted, we have a long history of charging the maximum allowable rate. My experience has been that whenever we go out to the public, they never ask to increase a rate. And so you're not making a decision today. So if there is any appetite amongst council to look at what we've done in the past and hit that maximum chargeable rate, then you should go out to the public and do that. And we know that the development industry will not be happy, but that's your opportunity to consult. If you go out at 25 or 50%, I'll buy a steak dinner. Do anyone would say that we'll come back and say we'll do 100%? And so I certainly think, while we're not taking a position, I think it's something you should consider, as this is not the time to set the rates.
Okay, and so essentially, I mean, you're politically saying we don't have a position, but in reality, you should really be going out and looking at the whole amount and see what the community reaction is.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's been our history as a municipality, and I think it's certainly the best way to get good public engagement.
Okay, and then to you or Mr. Hagee, thus far, I mean, have we at all engaged with the industry through the group that exists? Because I kind of, at my last meeting where I spoke with them along with the other mayors and the regional chair, got the impression that we have had some dialogue with the industry group.
So I've been to the Waterloo Region Home Builders Liaison Committee and provided them some information about, our process is kicking off, here's the timeline. I didn't say anything about rates. We weren't far enough along to know even what ballpark of rate increase we were looking at. So we've had that discussion with them already. When this report was posted, I made sure to pass it on to the representative that they said at that meeting who to filter the information through, so they're provided a copy of this report. In that email, I let them know that this meeting was going on. It would be webcast. It will be available online as well.
Okay. Because, I mean, in general, I will say that, I don't, they haven't spoken specifically about this particular issue, but they have spoken about, in general, our level of engagement with them on de-season and other things. They've spoken quite favorably about the industry working group that we have with them in that regards, and that comment was certainly shared with me at the last gathering. Okay, thank you. Councillor Gazzola. Oh, sorry, Councillor Gallo-Silock, comments? Councillor Michaud, comments? Okay, Councillor Gazzola.
Well, I'll start off by, when I had looked this earlier at home when I was going over this, I had some different thoughts about it, but stopping to think now, I can see that really what we do here has very little impact on home sales and property sales and all that. I know we've always taken the max, and I've always supported that in the past. If you divert from that, you start phasing in, means you're going to have to start pulling out projects, and a lot of these projects are recreational projects that you're going to have to pull out, or they're projects that are recreation that haven't really been clarified in there, but we know that when you're looking at your master plan, you know that you're going to get involved in that, but they haven't been specified. History has shown that these large communities around the GTA have always had high DC charges, and they just keep growing and growing and growing. So I don't think it's impacted them. And on the other hand, here we hear so many great things about Kitchener. Kitchener's a growing committee. It's a place that people want to be. So I don't see any concerns there on a competitive basis with communities around us. We started having public engagement meetings here. The stakeholders that are going to be there are developers, are home builders. And I'm afraid, and there's no sin to making profits, but I'm afraid that if any winnings that come by on that, in those scenarios, if we talk to developers, those winnings are going to go in the pocket of the developers and not to the homeowner. I can feel certain that the majority of that would happen like that. So, The bottom line here is, and I've always fought for the taxpayer. If we start to fiddle with this, then the only way that it can carry on is, either development charges pay for it, or the existing taxpayers pay for it. And I want to err on the side of our existing taxpayers who have been there, some of them for 20, 30, 40, some of them for 50 years. I want to be on their side because I think we have to look after them. I don't think we hurt our development industry. I think it carries on. We have a tremendous community here. Everybody wants to come here. And I think as far as the people, the new people that are moving into our community, they're coming into a nice community and I'm sure they're prepared to pay what it takes to get into the homes and to have the services. Not like when I came to the community, I had to wait 15, 20 years for a lot of these services that we worked so hard on to get to the point where we can put the services in first, or if not first, very quickly after people had moved into the community. And when we start, we have this tool. The province doesn't give us many tools that we can work with like this. We have this tool, and I think we should take full advantage of it and to the benefit of our existing taxpayers. So I will be pushing for carrying on with the max rate as we have in the past.
Councillor Galloway-Silak.
Yeah, actually, I would move that the max rate be what moves forward, as staff have suggested that we give some indication. So I think there needs to be a vote on that.
Okay, is there a seconder for that? Second. Thanks, Councillor Gazzola.
And just a few comments. I represent an area of growth, and I can tell you that in the last couple weeks, there's been 2 new phases of new development opening, and there were lineups in order to get some of those lots in housing. And so I think it continues. We're not lacking the buyers of new homes. What we are lacking is the infrastructure in new areas of the city. We have, Councillor Gazzola mentioned some 20 years. Well, the whole Williamsburg area has started over 20 years ago, and they still don't have a permanent community center. And so we're still waiting on a number of pieces that we've fallen behind on in order to make that happen. And I know it's in this year's, or in this DC study finally, but we can continue to fall behind, or we can take the better information that we have and doing the catch-up that staff said we need to do so that we can have a higher rate, because we didn't have that information in 2014. So we need to use the information we have now and make the best decision that we can. We know, as it's been mentioned, that Waterloo really doesn't have any more green fields growth left, and Cambridge is doing their study, and it sounds like from staff that they're going to be around the same rates as we are. So our immediate competitors are there. We know that there are many projects that weren't included in the LFMP, and we know that we are deficient in soccer fields, in ball fields. We know that we are also looking to build an arena, and some of those things might be able to actually happen within this DC study with some of the provisions that are being put in there. Why wouldn't we take the max amount of rate when the expert consultant says it doesn't impact housing affordability? I think it's important for us to continue to move forward with our stakeholders talking about the max rate moving forward.
Councillor Michaud.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have to concur with Councillor Galloway, as I am representing a ward that is seeing exponential growth as well. I think Kitchener does a great job in creating a caring community, and we work really hard to make sure the quality of life is good for everyone, and that includes all the services that we offer. And as I asked earlier, infrastructure isn't mentioned in this, but I'm sure it's a very large component, so I will support the maximum amendments today. Thank you.
Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor Vrbanovic. It comes down to who pays for our services, our infrastructure, our facilities, our projects, and it's got to be fair between our property taxes and our development charges. And, you know, part of the reason this is a great place to come and develop is because we have such a vibrant city. We have so much to offer. And we can only keep staying vibrant and adding to our facilities and completing projects and have great infrastructure if we have the funds to pay for it. So this is a great report. A lot of work has gone into it. And I do feel that while it's not pleasant to go to anyone and say we need more money, going to our property base, tax base for this would bring a lot of resentment, I think, from our taxpayers. So I think that, you know, the increase to the maximum rate is hard decision, but it's the right decision.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Thank you, Mayor Vrbanovic. I'm not prepared to support the 100%. I would have went along more with the 50%. And my reasonings for that is when I look at this report, and I don't think it's no disrespect to the consultant or staff, but I have a fundamental issue that if we're expecting 65% growth in the suburbs, then the suburb community development charges should pay for those services, not the central neighborhoods where there's already parks, where there's already the infrastructure in place. That is a fundamental issue that I have, and I think this is all going on the backs of the central neighborhoods, in my opinion. And that's why I will go with 50% because I think it does accomplish more than what we would expect as far as projects will go. And again, like when I look at district parks in general, that is for the entire city. It's not just for one area. And I think if our city needs that, then it should be more than just development charges that are paying for that. And I think we need to look outside of that, and if it's something that we really need and our community needs, then we need to look outside of just development charges. That's just my opinion.
Councillor Marsh.
Thank you. I'm hesitating to vote one way or another, only because I just want to make sure that we're not going to be tied to a decision that I want to be able to have the right to change our minds in June. So I guess I just want to make sure that the motion that we vote on today is not binding.
No, the motion today is simply to give an indication as to what level we're going out for consultation with, and that level that's proposed is 100%.
Yeah. Okay. And so I'm prepared to support the 100% at this moment. In part because I'm very pleased with the plans to conduct a study on affordable housing options, and I'm confident that the purpose-built rental housing scenarios will include options for delaying or deferring or even potentially reducing DC charges in exchange for building more affordable housing units.
Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Mayor. I'm a little taken back that we're going with this direction, going 100%, simply because of the disproportionate level of increase to the central neighborhoods, as already said. But Councillor Ioannidis increased to 142% It's difficult to take it in any way as that's going to have a impact, and not in long term, but immediate. I think through the questions, the aspect of affordability due to DC charge increases, it's still debatable. Ultimately, it is the end user that pays the charges, and whatever increases the end unit cost has an effect of affordability. At the same time, it's not to say that I'm not cognizant of the fact that we have to pay for the services somehow, and it has to come through development charges. And there are neighborhoods in our community, like the Southwest, that has been waiting for a long time to get those amenities. And I think those neighborhoods absolutely deserve and need to get that sooner than later. But when we take a look at the chart that's provided in the DC-funded projects, so if you look at it in relative terms and bring this into full context, through 50%, the only thing that will have an effect on is provision for fire protection. Again, that's not that we're not going to fund it, but it would have to be funded in a different way. Provision for indoor recreation, and provision for outdoor recreation, and provision for additional equipment. Yet the key things, like where I'm sensitive to, again, my ward is boundary to this area, and any improvements to these neighborhoods will be an improvement to the area I represent. Indoor pool for RBJ Schlegel Park, here on Brigadoon Community Center. Indoor turf, RBJ Schlegel Park. Rosenberg Community Center. As well as even the Forsyth Community Center. These were the pillars of the items that we had supported just a couple weeks ago through our recreational facility master plan. We accomplished all of that through the 50%. The way I see it is, we could go for the big increase and get lower revenue because there will be a shifting of projects to other communities. As awesome as Kitchener is, Stratford's pretty cool, Guelph is pretty nice. Woodstock is doing all right too. These projects can go there also. So the overall cost and impact of the development community should be taken into account, because if you don't get the expected pool in to the reserve, we may not be able to accomplish these projects. I'd rather go in something that the development community can phase in appropriately and still continue on seeing Kitchener as a viable market to build. I think the 50% is the way to go, and I move that as an alternative.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you. I want to go to the public with something that I can support. I'm not seeing this as a negotiation. I'm seeing this as something that we go to the public and say this is what we need to do. So I hope that some members of council aren't saying go with a maximum rate thinking that it's a negotiating standpoint and they're going to come down later. I think we need to send a clear and consistent message to begin with. I would agree that 50% is that message, because when I look at the graph that was presented to us, what we're actually saying is it would be more costly to develop here than in Ottawa, than in London, than in Guelph, Hamilton, and even Toronto. And that's before the region does their rate review, which would bump us up even higher. And I'm just worried that we perhaps don't quite understand the ramifications of that. The last point I want to leave people with is, we talked about pro forma, but what we're really talking about is what doesn't get built. And at the end of the day, it's not just DCs, but we cannot collect DCs and we cannot collect property tax on what does not get built. So I think we're going too far. I would support the 50%, and I do even think that within that, it should be phased in, and I think maybe the end point at the end of the 5 years is actually higher than that 50%, to make sure that it ends up being revenue neutral in terms of getting that 50%. But I think phasing it in is also an appropriate step, so I won't be supporting the motion as is.
Councillor Galway-Silak, I'll let you speak last, so I'll just make my comments first. I will be supporting the recommendation that's before us. Just last week, we saw the latest statistics come out from StatsCan, and those statistics said that this CMA, or Census Metropolitan Area, had the second largest level of growth in the country. And so there is no shortage of growth happening in this area. What there is a shortage of is the kinds of recreational amenities that we need in order to make sure that this community continues to be a great place to live, work, and play in. And if we want to continue to see growth happen in this area, and if we want to continue to see people to be attracted to this area, and if we want to, most importantly, be able to get the kind of talent we know we're going to need in an increasingly competitive workforce, it means that we need to make sure the community has the amenities, recreational, cultural, and others that are necessary to attract and retain that kind of talent. And so, in my mind, this is a key step towards allowing us to continue to make those investments so that we can stand a reasonable shot at success. Increasingly, what we're hearing from companies is the challenge to find the talent that they need. And so we're going to be in this increasingly competitive workplace amongst everyone. We're already a very affordable community. Guelph was mentioned. Yes, they have lower DCs, but I can tell you real estate prices are higher in Guelph than they are here. And so, one has to ask, where's that difference going? It's clearly not going to the home purchaser in the process. So, I think the other thing that's important to remember here is this is the beginning of a dialogue, and all we're doing today is we're saying these are the things that are important, and we're going to go out to the community and have that dialogue with the sector. There's no doubt that we need to look at and consider the full range of costs, and we'll do that as the process moves forward. But I think the other thing, that we need to think about, this is one issue. There's a separate issue that we're going to need to deal with, and, we know that is slated to be in our strat plan, and that's the broader issue of affordable housing, rent geared to income housing, subsidized housing, and that needs to also be done in collaboration and partnership with the provincial and federal partners, who do have a game plan. Certainly federally, there's the National Housing Strategy and so on. And so we need to see how do we meld all these things together, and we have a process in place to do that. So for many of the reasons that have already been raised and the ones that I've just articulated, I will be supporting Councillor Galloway-Silac's motion. Councillor Johnson, before I go to Councillor Galloway-Silac.
Yes, thank you. I totally agree with what Mayor Urbanovic was saying, that we have an amazing community here, and one of the things that makes our community so incredible is our community centers, our infrastructure that we have here, and our programming, the amount of money and that we put into making sure that our community is a great place to live. And I have no doubt that we are only going to continue to soar in terms of our development. I don't think that this is an impediment. In fact, I think it's something that makes us that much more attractive to people wanting to develop in this community. And in terms of consistent messages, we've just come through our budget process where we were proud that we were able to keep to have a great budget with really great things in it and keep it below the rate of inflation. And that was talked about consistently over and over by the majority of our council, that was a great thing to be able to do. So to not then have the ability to build the infrastructure without having to put that back on the taxpayers, I think would be an inconsistent message to them, as opposed to what we've been saying about our budget all along. So for those reasons, I'll certainly be supporting the motion before us. Thanks.
Councillor Galloway-Silac.
Yeah, I just want to make another brief comment. I think that we are at the beginning and the dialogue is good, and I'm here to listen, but I also think that we have to justify the rate increase, and that's why some of my comments have been made today. And I further comment so that we have the full context. The suburbs have been supporting the central neighborhoods for years, and it's not time to flip that back. And put it back on the suburbs. They've supported the KPL Central Library. They've supported parking garages. They've supported Victoria Park, just to name a couple. Can we think of the last time something was actually built out in the suburbs with DC charges other than roads? It's been a while, and roads are good too, and development's good, and development's good for property taxes. I get all that, but the suburbs have also had to support the whole city has, but they also supported the downtown DC exemption, and so through property taxes. I also just think that the provision sections of outdoor rec and indoor rec are important because we know that we're deficient in many recreational areas. And so we need to keep those in there because I know we'll see projects that either we have an opportunity to partner with or continue to move forward, that if we have that flexibility, it will help us be able to do that. So I really do strongly believe that the max rate is the way to go.
Okay, so all those in favor? Okay, we'll do a recorded vote.
So there's no amendment?
No, we're going with 100%. Those in favor? Those opposed? That is carried. Okay, motion to go in camera. There is an additional personnel item we need to add, so I'll need notice to waive motion. Councillor Marsh, Councillor Johnston. All those in favor, opposed, that's carried. So motion for all of the items, including the personnel item. Councillor Johnson, Councillor Galloway-Seelock, all those in favor, opposed, that's carried. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Davey, Councillor Michaud, all those in favor, opposed, that's carried. I'll get you later.